Okay, brilliant. Good morning, everybody. My name is Steve Barker. I work for the Planning Advisory Service, which is part of the Local Government Association. This is a very popular session today. I'm really pleased that Michael Bingham from MHCLG has made himself available to have a conversation really today, to do a presentation. So the session today is we're looking at the changes that happened on the National Planning Policy Framework back in December. Already feels quite a long time ago already, to be quite honest. But this is obviously all part of a programme of change which the new government has brought in around planning. So Michael's going to take the opportunity just to give you some information about the changes around the National Planning Policy Framework, but also where this fits into some of the wider reforms as well that are also going on and coming up in the future, in the next few months, I suppose. There's quite a lot going on at the moment. So I'm kind of really pleased that we can kind of do this. There's quite a few people on the call. So we are running the questions through Slido, and you'll be able to access Slido from either the links or the QR code, which is on the screen at the moment, or via the NPPF Slido button, which is in the events page, in the MS Teams page as well. So, so do post your questions up on Slido. We will only be taking questions from Slido rather than via the chat. So do put them in there. You can upvote, and we'll try and get through most of the most popular questions anyway. There are going to be so many people on the call. The chance we're going to get through all the questions is not realistic, I think. So, but we will be taking all the questions away, and we will be having a look at them, and we'll be using those questions to put some FAQs out, along with some of the other work that we've been doing around the NPPF changes as well. Okay, so this is how we're going to structure the day for the session. So we're going to be running until 12 o'clock. Michael's going to run through a presentation for a while, and then we have a panel of councillors to funnel the questions to Michael, to funnel the questions to Michael. So they're going to be looking at the questions you post on Slido. So please do upvote things that you like, add questions you like, add questions you want. So I'm really pleased that Councillor Toomey Hawkins from South Cambs, Mike McClusker from Salford, Richard Cluer from Wiltshire, and Loic Rich from Cornwall have kindly put themselves forward to be able to funnel the questions to Michael. And then following that, Michael's going to leave, and the panel are just going to have a bit of a chat about, how they're going to respond to the NPPF and the challenges that they've got, and how they're seeing the sort of the changes around planning for their authorities, and give their chance to comment, if you like. So, so I think, without further ado, I'm going to pass on over to Michael, if that's okay.
Thank you, Steve. Morning, everyone. I hope everyone can hear me. If you can't, then gesticulate in whatever way Teams will allow you to. So, as Richard said just now, I'm Michael Bingham. I am Deputy Director for Planning Policy at MHCLG. So I'm responsible for the National Planning Policy Framework, for planning guidance. I'm also responsible for our work on planning for the environment. It's really great to be speaking to so many councillors this morning. I spent about 12 years of my career in local government working as a planning officer before eventually winding up in central government. And I've worked on various things here, but most recently the NPPF. The idea today is partly to recap on what was changed in December last year in terms of national planning policy. But I think it's probably also useful for you to give you a bit of a look ahead to what you can expect over the next year. You may have picked up over the weekend and this morning, there's been quite a bit of material in the media about the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, which we are expecting to be introduced this week. I can't give you lots of detail on that today, but I can give you a flavour of what to expect. So we'll turn to that later in the presentation. So I think Steve or Paz are kindly driving the slides for me, so you'll forgive me for being in full Chris Whitty mode as we move through these. And also apologies in advance for various pings in the background. There are various things that I can't mute as I speak, but hopefully it won't be too irritating. So with that, shall we move on to the first slide, please? So let's start with the National Planning Policy Framework. You will know by now that we made quite a few changes in December last year, following a consultation that kicked off last July. The changes that were made were very much the incoming government's priorities for things that it wanted to do to planning policy within the system. So by no means every aspect of planning policy was touched by those changes. They reflect, in particular, manifesto commitments and one or two other things that the government felt were most pressing to be dealt with. And the two biggest things by far, I think, are the changes to the way that housing need is assessed and the changes to Greenbelt. So I'm starting with those. In terms of housing need, we've had since 2018 this standard method for working out the starting point for plan making in terms of how many homes might be needed in each area. Now, the reason that a standard method was first introduced in 2018 was that prior to that, different authorities have been using many different methods, and it was leading to prolonged arguments and examination about the details of those methods, whether they were right, and so on. So the government of the time decided to try and streamline things by setting out a recommended method. The new government has changed the way that that is calculated. So instead of using a method based on household projections, the new method takes housing stock and applies an affordability or unaffordability, if you like, multiplier to that. The reason for that was that I think that the household projection-based method had become increasingly discredited in many ways because it was getting increasingly out of date in terms of the data that it was using. And it wasn't reflecting sufficiently the real pattern of housing pressures in different parts of the country. So the government's moved to this method, which it hopes will be more stable. But in doing so, it's also removed the urban uplift that applied to the largest urban areas under the previous government, which it felt was an arbitrary addition. And it has also upped the total number of houses that comes from applying this standard method. So the total is about 370,000 per annum. Now, this is slightly different from what was consulted on in July, in that the affordability adjustment has been tweaked slightly, but it's largely what was consulted on over the summer. Crucially, the framework has made this less of a recommended method and much more of an expected method. Authorities are expected to use this as the starting point for plan making. But also, crucially, it remains the starting point. So it is up to local authorities to take the method and the number that emerges from it and to then test that in their areas, taking into account the policies in the framework as a whole. So you'll probably know that from the framework, there are certain nationally recognized constraints that may press the number. And also there's the test in the presumption in favour of sustainable development that allows the number to be departed from if there would be severe impacts So there's a degree of flexibility and discretion there that needs to be tested through the plan making and examination process. Next slide, please, Rich. Onto the green belt. I think you could fairly summarise the changes that the government's made as the most substantial since the green belt was really embedded in national policy in the post-war period. There has, of course, been green belt release, and there have been green belt additions over many, many years, but it's been rather ad hoc and sporadic. We know that lots of authorities have had to assess their green belt, release bits of green belt as they've been preparing plans if they've not had other means of meeting their housing need. But the government wants to make that process more systematic and is following through on its manifesto commitment that the lowest quality greenbelt land, what it called grey belt land, should be a viable target for release if that's the only way of meeting housing requirements in a particular area. So what the NPPF has done is create this new category of grey belt land, defined in terms of the land that least satisfies the purposes of the green belt in the first place, as well as embracing just pure brownfield land that may exist within the green belt. Now, this can be released in two ways. It can be released through the plan making process, if that's the only way that an authority can meet its housing need. But there is also provision in the framework in certain circumstances for grey belt land to be released through the decision-making process if, again, there's a need that isn't being met in the area. Now, what can be released through development management is slightly more tightly bounded than what can be done through plans. So when it comes to plans, authorities can, if they choose, to release land that isn't grey belt, if it would be in a more sustainable location. When it comes to development management and any ad hoc release, it is limited to grey belt unless there are very special circumstances that can be demonstrated. So the process of getting to the final version was refined quite a bit between the consultation in the summer and the final version. We did listen very carefully to the feedback that we received. So the definition was tweaked, the circumstances in which land could be released was tweaked as well. And one of the critical parts of this calculation are the so-called golden rules as well, which if I talk to the next slide, please. So the underlying philosophy behind these golden rules is that greenbelt is land that should not, in principle, be released for development unless that's the only way of meeting need. So there's a higher test for releasing greenbelt quite properly than other greenfield land. So the government's philosophy here is that if greenbelt land does exceptionally have to be released, then local authorities and the communities they serve should get rather more back than they otherwise would. So that is why these golden rules were put in place, to make sure that not just the necessary infrastructure is provided and that green space is provided, and there are various criteria about what that green space should do, but crucially also that there's an elevated level of affordable housing, which initially is set at pre-existing local plan targets plus 15%. Capped at 50%. In future, local plans will be able to bring forward bespoke targets, but that's the sort of interim approach. Again, this was revised following consultation, but it's an important part of the overall equation of greenbelt release. Can I have the next slide, please? And to put more flesh on the bones of that, you may have picked up that in the last couple of weeks, we have published guidance on greenbelt release to set out more fully how those principles in the NPPF can be applied. It was very clear from what we'd heard from the consultation that further guidance would be appreciated. So we set out more detail on how to define the parcels to be assessed through Greenbelt reviews and the criteria to be used in terms of assessing whether Greenbelt land meets the different purposes for which the Greenbelt exists. It also sets out more detail in terms of some of those other requirements that I've talked about when Greenbelt land might be released. Next slide, please. We know that whenever we change the NPPF, it's not easy for you in preparing plans. You need to navigate what it might mean if you've already got a plan in progress. So the government thought very carefully about what transitional arrangements were needed. There is always a balance here, of course, because when important changes to national policy are made, from a government point of view, it's desirable that those kick in as quickly as possible. But equally, this government, just like its predecessors, is keen not to disrupt plan making when that's at an advanced stage. So there is a balance to strike here. So the way that this government did that was to delay the effect that the NPPF changes had for 3 months, to say that plans at examination would continue under the previous version of the NPPF. And then where plans hadn't yet reached examination, but had reached Regulation 19 stage, they could carry on in certain circumstances. And those circumstances depend on the extent to which that emerging plan was meeting the new local housing need figure. In some cases, there's the requirement for plans to take a step back if they were meeting less than 80% of that figure. That is quite a different approach from what we consulted on. And again, we listened very carefully to the feedback that had been provided during the consultation period before ending up at that final position. Obviously, this means different things for different authorities, and obviously it is a balancing act, but that's where the government landed this time around. Next slide, please. The NPPF changes were not just about housing by any means. As I said, they reflected a number of priorities that the incoming government had. One of those was about wider economic growth, and the employment chapter in the document was revised to place more emphasis on a number of key economic sectors that link to the government's emerging industrial strategy, where it is seeking to identify key sectors for driving the UK economy over the coming years. There's also been stronger support inserted into the framework for updating key public service infrastructure like hospitals. And also in terms of communities more broadly, this government has placed more emphasis on not just affordable housing, but in particular social rent housing. And then one important addition that was made in the final version published in December, and one that links to the wider government efforts to try and tackle obesity, was to insert a policy that restricts hot food takeaways and other fast food outlets within walking distance of schools or other places where children and young people gather. We'd had a lot of feedback because we asked a general question about this in the consultation, and there was a lot of feedback saying that this sort of intervention would be desirable. So hopefully that will have a substantive effect as it starts to kick in. Next slide, please. There are quite a few changes on the environment as well, in particular in relation to planning for the way that we tackle climate change and planning for renewables. So you may recall that one of the very first things that this government did when it came into power was to remove the effective ban on onshore wind in England. The NPPF in December went further to give more weight to other forms of renewable development like solar. We also made a couple of tweaks to planning for flood risk. So the so-called sequential approach to locating development, which says that you should prefer sites at lower risk of flooding to sites at higher risk of flooding. We've tweaked that the way that that applies slightly to say that you don't need to go through that if it's clear that there is a site where none of the development itself would be at risk of flooding. And we've also expanded policy on the use of sustainable drainage systems so that such systems or sustainable drainage features are used in any form of development where there might be drainage implications. More broadly, there are some changes to the climate change chapter as well to highlight the importance of that as a consideration in development management as well as plan making, which to some extent was implicit already, but we've drawn that out a bit more fully. And there's also a small change on biodiversity, where we're being explicit again about the importance of nature-friendly features like swift bricks and hedgehog highways and things like that. Next slide, please. I was going to touch on design briefly as well, because this attracted quite a lot of commentary when both the consultation version came out and the final version was published. So there was quite a lot of comment that the government had removed most of the references to beauty that the previous government had inserted into the framework. And there were some suggestions that the government was therefore watering down its commitment to design. And I think that the thing to emphasize here is that the government remains just as committed to good quality design as its predecessors. But the problem that they had picked up was that beauty as a concept to apply in planning decisions is quite a difficult one. It's quite nebulous to pin down, whereas more long-established terms like well-designed places are better understood and link more effectively to things like our National Design Guide. So beauty has been kept in one or two places as an overarching strategic objective for something that the planning system should strive for, but the terminology in terms of how you seek that through individual developments has reverted to more long-established terminology. And to underpin that, the presumption in favour of sustainable development, which is this thing that kicks in where there's inadequate land supply in the system, essentially, has been tweaked to emphasise the importance of design quality and sustainable locations and making good use of land, and also providing affordable housing where the presumption applies. So design is still very much something that this government strives for. Next slide, please. So what next? So first of all, planning policy. The government has said more than once now that it is minded to move ahead with producing a clearer set of national policies for decision making. Now, you may know that the previous government, through the Levelling Up Act, legislated for something called National Development Management Policies, which would be a national set of policies, planning policies for decision making that would have legal force. So the present government hasn't decided exactly how these will be taken forward, but it is minded to move ahead with a national set of policies for decision making that we would consult on later in the spring. And the idea behind this is not just to promote greater consistency, but also to avoid local plans having to repeat policies on fairly standard things like heritage protection that can be set out at a national level. So there is that to come. Much more immediately, as the coverage over the weekend and this morning has picked up, there is a planning and infrastructure bill that is going to be introduced imminently. Now, I can't give you chapter and verse on that now. What I can say is that that bill will carry forward many of the ingredients that were trailed in the King's Speech when this was first announced. So there will be legislation in there on improving the way that major infrastructure projects, nationally significant infrastructure projects, are dealt with. There will be legislation on modernising planning committees and fees. Now, you may well have picked up that a lot of this has been trailed as well in some working papers that we've published, particularly one on planning committees, and also material that we put out on fees. There will be further reform of the compulsory purchase process to make sure that that can be used as effectively as possible in as many circumstances as possible. Crucially, we will be introducing legislation to introduce a more strategic approach to development affecting protected habitats and species. So many authorities, and I'm sure some on this call, have been affected by so-called nutrient neutrality rules, where development needs to demonstrate that there will be no net additional impact from things like nutrient pollution on protected habitats where they're already in a poor condition. Essentially, what we are proposing to do here is take a more strategic approach where you look at a protected habitat as a whole or a protected species as a whole and set up a levy into which developers would pay and which can then fund restoration of those habitats or indeed of those species at a more strategic and hopefully more effective scale. This is not just about nutrients. This can deal with any manner of harms or potential harms to protected habitats and species. So that is going to be one of the major chunks of the legislation. And then there will also be powers in the bill to deal with strategic planning or introduce strategic planning more fully. Of course, this already exists through spatial development strategy powers in a few areas where mayors exist, but the government's been clear about its intention to roll out those powers more fully across England. Now, there will be one or two other things in the bill, some of which has been trailed over the weekend as well. In particular, you may have picked up chatter about discounts for homeowners living near to high voltage pylons. So I would urge you to watch this space over the next 24 to 48 hours and you will learn more. Next slide, please. That is by no means the end of it. There are a number of other things going on. So the working papers I've just mentioned, there is going to be another one because the government is acutely conscious of the issues with build out. That's a thing that they and previous governments have heard a lot from local authorities about the permissions that authorities have proactively been granting, but the extent to which build out hasn't been happening. So we'll be publishing a further working paper with additional proposals on that. We are also moving forward with something called environmental outcomes reports. So this is a complete replacement of the systems of environmental assessment that currently apply to plans and major projects, currently known as strategic environmental assessment for plans and programs and environmental impact assessment for projects. You may well be familiar with the lorry loads of material that these things can generate currently. Again, this is something that the previous government initiated through the Levelling Up Act. It took powers to replace those systems with a more cohesive single system of environmental outcomes reports, intended to be more streamlined through things like standardized use of data, and crucially, a focus on outcomes from development in terms of the sort of high-level outcomes that the government currently sets out for different aspects of the environment. So we will be publishing a so-called roadmap setting out how we're going to be taking those forward. We also need to respond to a consultation on environmental outcomes reports that was commenced under the previous government and will be part of that package. Next slide, please. I think I'm almost at the end of my what next. You can tell there's a lot going on. So there will be more planning guidance. We've already published some. I've mentioned the Greenbelt guidance. We've also published guidance, in particular on how local nature recovery strategies can be taken into account in the planning process. So these are these new strategies setting out not just areas of environmental importance, but also crucially where there are opportunities to restore and improve the environment in different areas and to which planning can contribute. We've also launched an innovative bit on the government website with new guidance on how to create or update a local plan that brings together various pre-existing but also new bits of advice. And there will be other bits of planning guidance coming forward on transport, renewable energy, viability, climate change and flooding. Those are not by any means complete rewrites, although the transport guidance will be largely new. They are mainly updates to our existing guidance where the national planning policy itself has changed and some amendments are required as a result to those bits of guidance that support it. And then finally, on the guidance front, the government's also working on updates to its National Design Guide and National Model Design Code, with again an intention to update those later in the spring. Next slide, please. And then I think this is last. We are acutely conscious of the pressures that exist within the system, not least on local planning authorities in terms of finance overall, planning skills, and so on. There has been a program running for a few years now on how we can improve capacity and capability and resources within the planning system. We did a big survey. We've already introduced fees, which will apply, increased fees, which will apply from the 1st of April, subject to Parliament approving that. You can also expect the bill to be saying more on this. We've made available grants in certain cases for local plans and Greenbelt. We've also given money to bring more planners into the system. Now, we know this is going to be an ongoing issue, and it's something that the government is committed to continuing to work on. So I think that's my final point, really, that I know there is a lot of change here for local authorities. Hopefully, overall, it adds up to positive change. There are a lot of things here where the government feels the planning system can play a more proactive role in steering change and delivering benefits for communities, whether that's by operating at a more strategic scale, better providing the homes that we need, better supporting environmental recovery. But inevitably, introducing those things does mean a certain degree of change, and the government very much wants to work with you as it rolls those things out. Now, I think that is the last slide. Oh, no, there's one more slide. So I think most of this I've already covered. So the planning committee paper, which suggested a national scheme of delegation, mandatory training. As I say, you can expect that to be in the bill this week. And the planning fees, hopefully you are aware of. But again, you can expect more on this in the bill. The government did consult on locally set fees. So you can expect something on that this week. Now, I think hopefully that's the last slide, but let's see. Oh, no, there's more. Just when you think you're almost there. Plan making reforms. So one of the big things that the Levelling Up Act legislated for was some quite big changes to the system of plan making. Oh, my screen has changed. So the key things there are some new processes for plan preparation and some additional stipulations about the content of plans at different scales. Now, the government does intend to move forward with those reforms. We published a response to consultation carried out previously. It will need regulations to be prepared this spring. Grant payments I've already mentioned. So there will be further changes to the way that plans are produced. Again, we need to think carefully about the transitional implications on this, but hopefully there will be some beneficial streamlining and improvements to processes as a result of all this. Hopefully, I think that's the last slide, but let's check. Yes, that was the last slide. Right. Brilliant. Let me pause, have a drink, take the questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. And I mean, just goes to show there's a lot in there, and there's a lot of things that are kind of coming on, and questions are kind of being posted in Slido, and with really good questions actually covering a lot of the items that have been covered there, both around the NPPF reforms, but also around some of the further changes that are on route, particularly around some of the things around planning committee things. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of go around the sort of the panel to ask them to highlight the questions that they think they want to post to Michael now. Tumi, can I come to you first, if that's okay?
Yes, thank you, Michael. Definitely a lot going on. But one of the questions that has come up, quite a lot is there a requirement for the changes, all these changes that you've told us about? Is there a requirement for them to be voted on in Parliament, or has there been a delegated legislation committee to apply the changes? And I note that you mentioned that, for example, the increase in fees, if it's voted on by Parliament, whereas none of the others, did you say anything about it being voted on in Parliament? So perhaps you could clarify for us. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So different changes have different levels of parliamentary involvement. Some don't have any. So national planning policy, the national planning policy framework is national policy and is not subject to any form of parliamentary approval. The big structural changes to process that any government wants to make usually need primary legislation, so an act of Parliament. Most recently, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act put in place powers to make a wide range of changes, some of which I've talked about, and many of which were either commenced by the previous government or this government intends to commence. So I've mentioned those changes to plan making. I've mentioned environmental outcomes reports. I should have said actually that one of the things that was legislated for, but the new government has decided not to take forward, is a new infrastructure levy, which would have changed quite fundamentally the way that councils get developer contributions, which is currently done through Section 106 agreements or the community infrastructure levy. So that is not being taken forward. The government is thinking about what changes might be made to those existing processes, but it's clear that it doesn't intend to introduce the infrastructure levy. And as I've said, there will be fresh primary legislation introduced this week in the shape of the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Now, other things use what's called secondary legislation, which is legislation that hangs off powers in acts of Parliament. Most of those regulations simply need to be laid before Parliament and are subject to what's called a negative procedure, so they don't require an overt vote. Some, however, are what's called affirmative regulations and require a vote of Parliament. I can't remember, to be honest, because it's a long time since I worked on these planning fees are affirmative regulations or not. But in any event, regulations do need to be approved by Parliament, but often that's just in a passive way, as long as they're not voted against, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you. Very helpful.
Thanks. Richard, can I come to you next, please?
Yes, sure. I think one of the questions that's been posed that I think is most interesting is to ask how we are going to be able to maintain plan-led development, so development where a local plan is made and then built, in the face of the increase in housing targets, and in particular in the fact that, if anything, the 5-year land supply has been strengthened through these reforms. And 5-year land supply, for those of us at the moment without Greenbelt, is bluntly a game that developers can use to ensure that they can limit supply and get permissions where they want rather than where a plan wants. And with the involvement of Greenbelt, we run the risk of that becoming much wider and involving a lot more areas getting caught up in the 5-year land supply game. So how do we get plan-led development in the face of all of this?
I suppose the first thing to say is that this government, like its predecessors, actually, is very supportive of a plan-led system. And a lot of the reforms that it is pursuing are intended to underpin that in different ways. Hence the desire to move ahead with the changes to plan making procedures set out in the Levelling Up Act. Hence also the desire to have strategic planning more universally. So it does see plan-led as the way forward, but plan-led only works where those plans are maintained and are kept up to date. So I think the short answer to that is a plan-led system requires that proactive work in keeping plans up to date and in place. There are many, many reasons I know for not progressing a plan at any given point in time, but I think generally the balance of advantage always lies in cracking on with things, because there is always going to be change, there is always going to be turbulence. But if you've got an up-to-date plan with a supply of deliverable land, you're in a much stronger position than if you don't, is I think the basic answer.
Sorry, if I could just come back there. I mean, I accept the point. We should all have up-to-date plans. I have no argument with that. We should. And no matter how painful we're required, we should do it. But even where you've got an up-to-date plan, all developers have to do is slow down sites in the plan for whatever reason. They will doubtless argue they're valid. We would doubtless suggest they're not. And as a result, you suddenly can't maintain 5-year land supply, at which point it's a free-for-all, and your plan, their development goes out the window. It's that element. I think councillors would like to understand how the government will give us the ability to control that.
Well, as I said, the one of the bits of the jigsaw that the government hasn't yet put information out on or consulted on is how we tackle the issue of build out, because I think that is an important part of the equation that links to that 5-year supply point. So we are mindful of that.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Michael. Mike, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, lots of questions about the grey belt within the list. I guess there's a feeling that the government's focus on green belts, sort of jumping from urban brownfield to green belt without giving much consideration to, if you like, greyfield sites. By that I mean green sites with little green value that aren't green belt. Does that?
I think I understand the point. So if you work through the way that this bit of the National Planning Policy Framework works, green belt should always be the last resort, whether that's in a plan making context or in a decision making context. So if you've got an authority that is partly urban, partly green belt, partly green field, that's not green belt, then the green belt is meant to be the last resort. That's been the position with green belt since its inception, really. So green belt only kicks in, including the grey belt components of that, if there are other ways of meeting need. Now, there's a slight caveat to that, in that brownfield sites within the green belt may be capable of development under the rules. So there's a degree of kind of sequential approach almost. We haven't put it in those terms, but there's a degree of sequential approach. So, but you know, grey belt land that is green within the green belt shouldn't be released if there are other sources of land that aren't in the green belt.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Loic, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen, and thank you very much for the for that briefing, Michael. Yeah, a question's come in. I'll just read it. I'll read it verbatim. As a rural area, our housing quota has increased over 100%. There are no corresponding opportunities for industry and creation of employment to support this considerable increase to housing. New properties being built at present aren't selling. What is being done to rectify this disparity?
Well, as we said at the start, I can't talk about individual authorities, but in general terms, the number coming out of the standard method is, as I emphasised, the starting point for plan making. That needs to be tested in terms of any nationally significant constraints that apply. There may be, exceptionally in particular places, other reasons why that need can't be sensibly planned for, you know, for the reasons that are set out in the NPPF. And it's for each authority to make whatever case it wants to make through its plan preparation and at examination. And in future, we will have these new gateway processes as part of those plan making reforms that I talked about, that the government intends to move forward with. There'll be, I think, 3 opportunities for an early conversation with the planning inspectorate about how the plan is evolving, any problems or challenges that the council is facing in preparing its plan, and to get early steers on the approach. So I think that's the general answer without being able to get into the specifics.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Timmy, do you want to come back in again?
Yes, thank you. One thing that has come up, and there's actually, I think, 2 or 3 questions on this already from attendees, is the what happened this weekend when there was an article saying that councillors would be stripped of powers to block planning schemes or to determine housing applications, so to speak. And of course, we know that you know, communities like to see that there is they have an input through their councillors into what gets built. So what exactly is happening? Could you elaborate, please? And will there be any localism, you know, after the local government reorganization?
Yeah, this partly links to what would be announced this week in the legislation. So I can't give you kind of exact details of what's about to be announced, but it does link back as well to the working paper that was published on this topic. And in broad terms, the government thinks that there's merit in a national scheme of delegation that limits the things that committees would look at. It is not by any means doing away with committees. The government feels they play an essential role in the planning process, but there may be circumstances in which things are better dealt with by officers, and the government feels that there are certain standards that can be put in place nationally over and above things that might be decided locally. So, you know, in particular, to try and avoid things having to come back to committee where the principle of development is already established. So that's the general tenor of the approach, but watch out this week for the specific proposals.
Okay, but can I just come back on that? Does that mean that there will be, or the plan is to have a national scheme of delegation, so to speak, that local authorities can't change, or will they still be able to have their own scheme of delegation?
Well, as I say, I can't confirm the specifics today, but the government has been interested in how we apply a national scheme of delegation.
Okay.
Sorry for being slightly guarded, but I can't sort of I can't go into anything.
I can't draw you further. No.
And everybody, yeah, I'm sure there'll be lots of eyes on the infrastructure bill as it progresses. There's lots of things in there as well. So there's lots of things that are going to have some impact and changes, of which I'm sure the planning committee part will be part of it, of great interest, particularly to this audience as well. Richard, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, sure. I was going to touch on a question that's been raised around solar battery and NSIPs. The question in itself was asking about the impact of those being built on Greenbelt and the longer term land use, and whether that is potentially opening up areas of Greenbelt to housing as a result. I think more broadly, there are some other issues there around the provision of battery storage and whether we have an idea of what sufficiency of battery storage is, what the requirements are. At the moment, there's quite a scramble without necessarily a strategic understanding of where that's heading. And then there are other issues that I'm aware of from people all over the country where, for example, grid connections are having to go a very long way cross country, involving buried pipes and significant disruption. Close to home, I've had one that had no grid connection for a solar application, which made no sense at all. It's like building a house without a road. I just wonder whether it's going to be possible to get some clarity coming out about these particularly solar applications, what the longer term impacts are. Okay, there's a presumption now that they can continue with solar at the end of this. Their period, continued use of solar would be fine, but whether there'll be some guidance about what's needed, where it's needed, and whether that grid connection is actually a requirement or not.
I think the broad answer to that is that there is a lot of thinking going on across government about energy and how we secure our energy supplies and what that means. And equally, there is a lot of thinking going on about things that use a lot of power. So data centers, in particular. So we have multiple intersecting challenges. How do we increase our energy resilience? How do we do that in a way that helps tackle climate change? How do we accommodate things like data centers that are necessary for economic growth but use a lot of energy? And how do we locationally square all of those different things so that, for example, energy generation and energy consumers are coexisting as much as possible? So there is a lot of thinking, as I say, taking place about those things and about how and to what extent the government can set out any sort of strategic principles. So again, I can't give specific details of that at the moment. But I think it is something that we may need to reflect on if we do further changes to national planning policy. As I said earlier, the government is intending to move forward with a national set of policies for development management. It's worth emphasising that if we do that, well, as we will do that, that will also affect policies for plan making, because you can't take out from the NPPF the decision making bits without at the same time altering the plan making bits. And in the course of doing this, we'll be needing to look across national planning policy as a whole. So not just the things that were updated in December, but looking more broadly, because of course many aspects of national policy were not touched in December. So there are issues like this that we are giving active thought to, and which the government more generally, as part of its industrial strategy, for example, and its plans for energy, is thinking very actively about. So they're very good issues, Richard, to raise.
Thank you, Michael. Mike, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, just a quick question on what powers will there be to stop the deliberate dereliction of green belt sites so they become grey belt?
I think it will be perfectly legitimate for local authorities to take that into account when making decisions on green belt or, alleged grey belt land if there's deliberate despoiling of that land. Of course, in order for it to get into the territory of being classed as grey belt, I would expect quite a considerable degree of despoiling to have to happen, which by its essence would probably be subject to enforcement action or, liable for enforcement action.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Loic, do you want to come in next?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. Just this is really to do with public transport, really. How does the revised NPPF sort of look at things like car dependency and just pushing people more into active travel, public transport? I haven't had time to look at it, but there's a report from Transport for Homes that it's saying that the majority of new builds are still creating very car dependent housing estates.
Thank you for that question, whoever asked it, and for picking that one out, because it makes me realize that one thing I didn't touch on in that presentation was transport. And there was an important change, in fact, two important changes to the NPPF made in December. So one is in the transport chapter itself, we now place an emphasis on what we've called vision-led approaches to transport. So rather than the sort of predict and provide method that's dominated transport assessments for many years, the government's now saying overtly that councils and indeed those bringing forward development should start with what kind of place we're trying to create, working with communities, and then think about the transport infrastructure that is needed in that context. So I think that's both an important philosophical shift and an important practical shift in terms of how we plan for transport. And as I flagged, we are working with DFT to update the transport planning guidance to come into line with that, which will set out much more fully what all that means for things like transport assessments. As part of that vision-led approach, the NPPF already talks about the importance of locating development in sustainable locations, particularly where that's major development. But one of the things that we've heard is that sometimes, in particular, when the presumption in favour of sustainable development kicks in and there's not enough land supply, that you do see developments that are not in well-connected locations. And that is why the other important change that we made in December was to change the presumption so that we've added caveats about the particular importance of bearing in mind national policy on design and on sustainable locations, as well as affordable housing when the presumption's applied. So that's intended to counter that tendency and to give you more scope to push back on schemes where they're not sustainably located.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Tumi, I think on my rounds of the panel, I think you're next.
Yeah. There is this question where, and I know one or two areas that have something to do with this as well, which says, will NPPF standards, for example, the use of renewable energy sources, be a flaw that can enable authorities to set higher targets rather than it being the limit that authorities can go to? So, for example, if say an authority is trying to go to 20% and it's at 10% currently, does that mean that's it? They can't demand more than 10 rather than the 20 that they were aiming for.
Yeah. Yeah, this links, there was a written ministerial statement, wasn't there, which remains extant, that puts limits on the extent to which plans can set targets for energy efficiency above and beyond building standards. So that remains extant at the moment. The reason for it is that it's one of those areas where there's a tricky balance for government, because we know a lot of local authorities would like to go higher than the building regulations on things like energy efficiency. But equally, the government's heard very strongly from providers of renewable energy technologies for buildings that they prefer more of a level playing field in terms of having the certainty to invest. So they would prefer higher standards to come forward through the progressive tightening of building standards, which is something that the government's doing, rather than to have lots of different standards in different places. So, you know, this is a difficult balance, because clearly the government is still committed to moving forward with measures to tackle climate change. The question is how best to do that. And currently this government's taken the approach of the previous government in saying we should focus on accelerating changes or moving forward with changes to building standards rather than having a plethora of local standards. But I'm sure this is something that it will be keeping under review.
I should hope so, because as I said, I know of some authorities who had been aiming higher, and actually, you know, the ministerial statement kind of dampened things. And we seem to be behind here in the UK when it actually comes to energy efficient homes. So we need to be hopefully seeing you know, changes come quicker. Thank you.
Richard?
Thanks. I'll pick a short one now. Is there going to be legislation or anything put in place to charge more for retrospective planning applications? And if I could suggest a figure, how about 1,000%?
I honestly don't know, to be perfectly honest. I don't know whether that's part of what the bill might set out, because I'm not especially close to that work. I mean, you know, it may be that something's announced this week, but I genuinely don't know.
Again, something to keep an eye on as the bill progresses through you know, through the House. So yeah, thank you. Mike?
Yeah, that was part of the consultation. Was one of the questions in the consultation about retrospective planning permissions. There's obviously pros and cons about encouraging people to regulate their development against punishing those who are just trying to dodge things. But yeah, question. I'm in Salford, in Great Manchester, and our numbers went down. We've got a question here from greener counties. You talked about the government felt it was an arbitrary figure that had been introduced that increased our numbers in urban centres. But someone's saying, why have the numbers been reduced in cities such as London and increased it in places like Cornwall and Cumbria?
Well, the urban uplift that had been applied previously through the previous method was just a flat kind of percentage increase on certain places. And I think it's highly arguable whether that was deliverable if you looked at the numbers for London, for example. There is still a degree of uplift in places like London inherent in the method. So if you take the stock and if you take the affordability multiplier that's applied, then the affordability multipliers will reflect the places with the highest housing demand. So places like London. In some other cities, of course, that price element will be lower. So particularly, you know, for example, in somewhere like Manchester, perhaps. But I should also say that the standard method is not intended to be a cap. So if there are authorities who think they can plan for more than that, for example, because of economic growth plans, then they can do. It's simply that the government's not forcing that additional element onto authorities where the price signals don't already suggest that that is an appropriate thing.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Thank you. Loic?
Thank you. Yeah, just about agricultural land, really. Will there be any protection for sort of the best quality land? Just given that food production is also a big issue now for national security.
Yeah, so the long-standing policies for trying to steer development away from the best and most versatile agricultural land remain in place. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that none of that land will be used for development, because it depends on the pressures and the circumstances in each area. But policy is pretty clear that where you've got a choice, then you should steer away from the best and most versatile land.
Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Michael, you okay for another round of questions?
Yeah, I can probably do one more round. It's a Monday morning
okay.
warm-up, this.
Yeah. Thank you. Timmy, do you want to comment?
Yes, and I will take this is a very short one, but hey ho, who knows what the answer will be. Why has the non-implementation of the 1 million existing consents been largely ignored? As you know, there's lots of applications that have had permissions, developers are not developing, and yet local authorities get penalized because the housing delivery falls short and they have nothing to do with the delivery. So why is the actual implementation being ignored and is all focused on planning?
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's ignored. The whole issue of build out is a very difficult one. We know that many councils have granted far more permissions, or permissions for far more units, shall we say, housing units, than are actually completed in a given period. Equally, there can be many, many reasons for that. It's not just developers doing things slowly. It can be an issue when infrastructure may hit a snag with a site coming forward, or a site changes ownership, or the developer decides that the plans need to change, or the economic circumstances have changed. There are many, many reasons why, as I'm sure you know, why a consent may not be developed. But we do need to try and minimize that gap. So to try and make sure that as many as possible consents are actually implemented. Now, this is an issue that previous governments have tussled with. This government also wants to take a fresh look at. As I've said, it's not ignoring it. It does intend to bring forward a further discussion paper, probably before the summer, on additional things that might be done. There were some powers taken in the Levelling Up Act, which the government would have the option of commencing, but there are other things that it may do as well. So I'm afraid it's another watch this space one, the answer to that one.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Richard?
Yes, thanks. I mean, a couple of questions relating to this. One of them was around the fact that about half of the houses that are being proposed to be built in an area are not able to be built because of water, the lack of capacity for water. I'm aware of other areas where electricity supply is a significant disabling effect on house building. Again, in my own context, highways improvements or highways capacity has now become a really serious issue in large parts of my county. How are we going to get to a point where that critical infrastructure is being provided in a way that is going to enable the revised housing targets to come close to being met? Because if we are so constrained particularly as we move to the larger councils, which we're going to be getting through local government reorganisation. How are we going to be able to avoid having to pile all the development into the only area that isn't constrained through whatever reason, which seems terribly unfair, not very good plan-led development?
Yeah, thank you for that one. That's a really important question. And water, I mean, both fresh water and wastewater in some places is a problem in many parts of the country, reflects years of underinvestment. But as you say, it's not just about water. There are other infrastructure constraints, but water is becoming a particular issue in many places. There isn't a universal answer to that, but I can give a sense of what some of the ingredients are. So one of the ingredients is looking at water efficiency standards and higher water efficiency standards in some areas. So this has been part of the conversation around Cambridge, for example. Another part of the answer is bringing forward the new infrastructure needed to provide sufficient capacity. So in particular, new reservoirs. One of the things, I haven't talked about it that much today, but one of the big things the government is trying to accelerate is major infrastructure projects. That includes things like major water infrastructure. Again, that's an issue around Cambridge. Another part of the equation is finding ways to accelerate planned investment by water companies and wastewater. So I've been spending quite a bit of my time talking to authorities around Oxford recently, where there's wastewater constraint. Another part of the answer in some places is about over abstraction of water, where we're having conversations with the Environment Agency and looking at whether permits can be tightened up. So there is no one single fix for this, but you're absolutely right that it is a major issue facing the country and facing development, but one that we are fully pitching into to try and find rapid solutions to.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Mike?
Yeah, there's a question here saying, will the Nature Recovery Fund be targeted at those areas that are on course to deliver significant housing growth in line with the government's housing targets?
We haven't yet settled on how the fund will be prioritised, so that the way the fund will work, for those that haven't read the working paper, is there will be something called an environmental delivery plan for a protected habitat or a particular protected species. It's most likely to start with protected habitats, as we think that's where the model will work best. We expect these to be produced by Natural England. There will inevitably have to be a degree of prioritization in terms of where they start. But I think one of the criteria is likely to be, as you say, where that kind of intervention can have the greatest benefit in terms of unlocking development. You know, we're acutely aware of the number of authorities across the country whose housing delivery has been inhibited by this. So we do want to take that very actively into account in how we prioritise. So there isn't a list yet, but we're thinking right now with DEFRA and with Natural England about how we prioritise, subject obviously to the measures being passed by Parliament.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, quite.
Oh, sorry, Mike. Yeah, do you want to
go in? No, it's okay. Thanks.
Okay. Larry?
Yeah, thank you. Can just to do, I'm sorry if this has already been covered, but is neighbourhood planning, can a neighbourhood planning group propose its own design code?
Propose its own design code? Yes.
Okay.
Okay, brilliant. I'm going to take a little bit of chair's prerogative, Michael, just before you go. Obviously, we're going into quite a period of change, both within planning, but also sort of wider local government as well over the the kind of coming few years, really. Have you got any kind of final advice you'd like to give about just, a lot of the people on this call are ones who have a lot of control over how local plans are going to form and move forward. Have you got any kind of advice just about the fact that we are going to be going through such a period of change, and some of that might be quite dramatic local government change as well as sort of structural change in planning?
I guess I've worked in planning for, I'm going to show my age now. I worked in planning for more than 35 years, probably more than that. And there has always been change in planning. I'm sure that many of you have been councillors or involved in planning in some way for many years as well. There is always change. Now, there might seem to be a particular amount at the moment, but I can remember periods in the past when there's also been huge amounts of change. I think one lesson from all of that from me is it's easy to sort of wait for things to happen and see what will happen before taking action on plans, for example. But I think history also suggests that it's better just to keep going, and there's merit in having a plan. There's more merit in having a plan than waiting and delaying. So I think that would be my overall message. Notwithstanding all of the many changes on the horizon, it's that one of trying to keep going.
Brilliant. Thank you, Michael. I really appreciate you kind of giving your time, and I really appreciate everyone's questions that have come in. I hope we've kind of managed to get through a large chunk of those. I think the panel have done really well to sort of pull together some of those and summarize some of those together. Lots of really interesting questions around how plans are going to come forward, some of the changes within that, the changes within the planning committee work as well, the infrastructure challenges, but also the delivery challenges as well within that. We will take all the other questions away and have a look at them. This is one of a series of sessions that we've been doing also with officers as well, and we're going to pull together a bit of more of a series of questions and answers that have come out from all of them, and these will very much fall into that group as well. I just want to say thank you to Michael. The panel's going to stay around and just have an opportunity to have a bit of a comment. But yeah, Michael, thank you very much for giving us your time today, and also your kind of candor in your responses. And I'm sure all eyes will be on the announcements this week, and as the bill progresses, the infrastructure bill progresses through the House of Commons and House of Lords.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you everyone for coming this morning and for all the very good questions. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the event. Brilliant.
Thank you, Michael.
Bye.
So yeah, I'm just going to now just give the panel their opportunity to sort of to comment, as they've been an amazing filter for the questions for the group, but I can give them a little bit more carte blanche now to give their own comments. So if you're happy, I'll go in the same order I did last time, if you like, because I seem to have a roundabout going around, if that's okay. Tumi, do you want to take the floor first?
Oh gosh, where do I start? I mean, the issue of the change, the immediate change in the housing numbers, and the effect that has wrought. I mean, we have local authorities that had sufficient higher numbers of 5-year housing land supply, and then with the increase overnight of the housing numbers, they're now well below 5 years. And lo and behold, already getting speculative applications coming in. And this isn't going to help with managing the existing workload with people just now throwing in speculative applications. And I think personally it's a mistake not to have given local authorities a longer period to adjust. And we're going to end up potentially with sites in locations that are not sustainable, because authorities will be wanting to get to that 5-year threshold. And I mean, we've been there, done that, we've seen it happen, and it's just going to get worse, in my view. So I think that's a big mistake.
Okay, Terry. Richard, do you want to comment?
Oh, I always want to come in on planning. Gosh, again, I mean, I think I won't completely monopolise yet I'll try and be good and polite. I mean, I think building on Tumi's point, I think the fundamental flaw with this entire set of reforms is that it's only going to make the issue of it's going to result in a lot of planning permissions being issued, but it's not going to result in houses being built. It's going to result in a complete loss of plan-led development and a free-for-all that at the moment in Wiltshire or other areas without much greenbelt we're already suffering from. But if you've got greenbelt, you're going to start suffering from it as well. So it's a really poorly thought through set of reforms, and that primarily comes from the 5-year land supply. I think the last government struggled with planning reform. I think one of the things that it did that was really sensible is to say, if you've got an up-to-date plan, there is no 5-year land supply. Build out the plan. And I think that's entirely reasonable. If developers have put sites forward for a plan, that should be done on the expectation they will be built out. There'll always be exceptional circumstances. You can find a way to deal with that. But that, I think, is critical. I mean, I think the other thing we're hearing and that is really, really worrying me is some of this nuance around planning committees. Now, I do take it that if you're an authority that's putting 20% of your applications to a planning committee, something's probably a little wrong in the way you're handling them. But there are always going to be really good, really specific cases why something should get to a planning committee. And to give a couple of very parochial examples, but examples that I don't think the government would think to understand. I got 2 cottages approved in one of my villages that were outside of the village boundary, therefore seen as unsustainable. The residents wanted them. The only way to get them approved was to take them to a planning committee. Officers wanted to approve them, but policy said no. I've got a listed building consent coming through. I won't go into too much details, but where the listed building want to say no, and the residents need to raise a beam, part of a beam, by about 10 centimetres for the time that they're in the house, and then see it lowered again. Again, the only solution to these micro issues is planning committees. And I'm really worried that government, in this urge to try and think that planning permission equals building, is just running a steamroller when what is needed is a much more careful sort of surgery with a scalpel and some sutures to tie the system back together and make it work properly. And one last comment, and I can come back in later if you want, but one last comment would be the other thing that I think is really worrying me. House building's falling off a cliff in my area due to a combination of inflation, higher mortgage costs, and now economic uncertainty. I mean, we normally build about 2,400 houses a year. We've got to build, including the buffers and whatever, about 3,800. Next year, my developers are forecasting maybe 1,000. The lack of joined up strategic thinking is going to make these reforms incredibly damaging.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I will give a little plug here, actually. Planning Advisory Service undertook a survey of the planning committees recently. I think it's like over 120 local authorities responded to it. And it's just some quite interesting data there about the formation and delegation rates and application numbers and sitting times, example. It's quite an interesting thing. It's published on the PAS website. Well, it's part published. I think we're going to fully announce it. But it's quite an interesting look. It's one of these things that you look at from your own committee and you kind of see where you sit a little bit. It's quite interesting. There's a lot of similarities in a lot of places, but there's definitely some who are very much outliers on some of that going forward. But quite an interesting read, and appreciate the challenges that the numbers bring, and the drive for how they fit into plans as well. Some there are some challenging concepts and changes here. Mike, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I understand the point that Richard's making. One key figure is the fact that there are that million that have been granted that haven't been built. At the same time as we've got an absolute housing crisis, which is crippling local authorities when we're trying to deal with temporary accommodation. Something big needs to change, and I welcome the government recognising that and trying to address it. My main concern is that what we need to be doing is making better incentives so that local people welcome growth. And the only way really to do that is around, how we meet the infrastructure demands that development brings. And glacial speed at which things like Highways England, National Highways, whatever they're called this week, British, the railway companies, you know, they're we're in a situation where they're planning to get back to, in Greater Manchester, planning to get back to the position we were in 2018 by 2035. You know, these things just have to be absolutely linked up with a real focus, because we can make all the plans that we want in trying to meet our local need. But if we can't enable it because the infrastructure is not there, because, you know, it pushes people against the plans, it pushes people against growth because they can't see how the two things are going to be squared. And that there just needs to be much less silo working in terms of infrastructure and how that links to our local plans.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. Larry, you want to come in?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think Richard hit on a lot of key points there. I think one, to me, I mean, especially in rural areas where there is going to be, I mean, there's no easy answer to the housing crisis. It's not going to, there's no solution that's going to make everybody happy. That's for sure. But I think one of the key things, especially when you're building on greenfield, it's community involvement and community input. And I know where a local authority puts a real emphasis and takes the public on a journey with them when they're designing new like garden villages and things like that. It's when you get that constant engagement with the parish councils, with the community groups on those designs, on where you put the infrastructure, where you put the open spaces, that really does help. And the housing crisis is almost an answer to one of those problems. The scale now of it, when you see people on middle incomes now unable to find anywhere to live, to rent privately, you know, key workers being put up in temporary accommodation, that really does force a change of view when it comes to local support for planning applications. But again, you know, it goes back to Richard's point: have we got the people to actually build the houses? Some areas are looking at double now, and in peripheral parts of the country, the construction companies just simply don't have the capacity to build to that scale. So there's a lot of unanswered questions, and I've always thought this: planning permission does not equal a house.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a real recognition, isn't there, that planning is part of a process, and that process is, you know, is about trying to enable the right delivery of development in the right place, but it is part of a process which is about bringing forward, which has to work with development industries, etc. It's very much with development industries nowadays, about trying to put that in place. I hope that the looking at future delivery and trying to make sure that it goes from permission to delivery is something that, you know, Michael's mentioned that the government is looking at. I think that's a large part to play, but it's all part of an economic system as well, isn't it? There's some challenges within that about making the right, having the right skills and materials available as part of that. And it's not just the permission. And I think, you know, it feels to me that is something that at least is being recognised, and I think it was recognised a bit previously in the other government, in the previous government as well. I think it just hasn't it didn't fix it, if you like. Whereas I think hopefully that's something that, you know, let's have to wait to see what the government comes forward with that. Tumi, something you want to come in?
Yeah, it seems to me that there's a lot of foot dragging when it comes to actually delivering homes. I mean, we had the Oliver Letwin report that just seems to have been binned or put in the archive somewhere, and, you know, going over the same thing. Why aren't houses being delivered? You know, plenty of planning permissions, but they're not being delivered. Why is our building industry not doing more of modern methods of construction? Why are we still focused solely on, you know, bricks and mortar? There's ways in which I think we can actually deliver, you know, houses quicker or dwellings quicker, but we're not doing it. Why do we still have what do you call it, where tenants can buy their houses, right to buy, right to buy? These things get sold at a discount, and then councils can't actually build to replace what's being sold. why are we down this road still? There's, I think, decisions that could be taken, that should have been taken. But with all the things we're seeing now, I just think, we're pushing things down the road when we can be doing more to get houses delivered. But resources is a big issue, not just planners, but builders. And I'm afraid the elephant in the room, Brexit, we lost a lot of skilled resources when Brexit happened. Nobody likes talking about it, but let's be real. We need to bring in the resources to enable us to actually deliver the construction industry to deliver these homes. But hey.
And then, I mean, there are some interesting. There's some really interesting resourcing challenges even within planning, and there are some things in train. The government has sort of trying to put some money into to fix some of those, but yeah, there's some.
It's not quick, is it, Stephen? It's not quick.
Not quick.
I mean, right. 300. What's 300 planners going to do, and when are we going to get them? And how do we get them skilled up to the level we want them now? Many more are leaving because of this.
And again, I can use a little bit of chairman's prerogative here just to say, Planning Advice Service working as part of the LGA is supporting the Pathways to Planning process, where they're looking to be able to bring in more planners into the system. They financially support placements within local authorities and to get their planning masters. If your authority isn't signed up, do get in contact with us and we can try and get you involved in the scheme. It is very, very popular, but it's a great opportunity because obviously it's places that are being covered by with salary contributions from the scheme. So Mike, you had your hand up, and then Richard, I know you said you wanted to come back in if you wanted to. So
yeah, no, it was, yeah, I agree with lots of things that Tumi's saying, and I think if you look at who's keenest to deliver, I would say it's local authorities to deliver social and affordable, truly affordable housing, I think we need a kind of post-war scale building of social housing. I've got 6,000 people on the waiting list in my authority, and there'll be authorities on this call with many, many more. That costs an absolute fortune in terms of dealing with temporary housing. Everyone's 35-year-old kids now are still living at home, this is just purchasing houses in most places completely unaffordable to most working people. We need something of a post-war scale in terms of social housing building. That's the only way I see out of it.
Okay. Yeah, that's it. I mean, I think we've gone through a cycle. Well, I think there's a real recognition that the need for housing is very much there. The challenge of how to make it affordable and to make it accessible and get it built is a big national challenge. Richard, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just changing topic away from housing and back on to the issue of solar and NSIP. I think this is something that we need to be looking at and exploring quite a lot more. Solar applications are coming in on a relatively wide scale now, including some incredibly large ones. I mean, over 2,000 acres in one case in Wiltshire. And these are these are really significant changes to the landscape and to the way that farming works in an area, the rurality of an area. They, as was highlighted by the question, sort of why I made sure it was asked, some of them have got some very odd structures behind them. I mean, I have 13 miles of cable they want to lay to get to a grid connection. That's 13 miles of at least 70 meters wide of the countryside torn up to lay the cable. I mean, just to connect it. There's no sustainability issue there. If you talk to planners from the National Grid, they are really frustrated by the fact that they have to just conform to providing connections to whatever bits of land they're told to, rather than having a strategic link up. And then to have sites coming in with no grid connection, and the fact that planners can still turn around and say, well, we ought to approve it because planning policy says we should. Something's gone really wrong in this space. We need solar as part of a mixed approach to renewable energy and a mixed approach to sustainable farming in the modern world. But we've lost all degree of moderation and all degree of sort of bringing people with us. We're just turning into a hideously contested battlefield. I don't know how we improve that. I mean, clearly there's discussion going on in government, but given the scale of development heading through the planning system at the moment, if that discussion doesn't hurry up, we'll have seen a massive transformation of some areas with no strategic thinking at all. And that's just nuts.
Okay, thank you, Richard. Loic, I'm going to give you final comments if you like.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just affordable housing, and we need affordable housing, we need council housing, we need every type of housing at the moment. Just normal kind of working family accommodation, and it's the private rental. It's the issue of the private rental market that's completely non-existent now. In places like Cornwall, we've got every time a 2-bedroom flat comes up for rent, you get 200 inquiries from people, and that's from nurses, doctors. The demand is huge, and the other issue with council housing and social housing, it costs money. We can build a million, but who's going to pay for all of that? A lot of the whole system of housing has changed now. Wealth of the country, all the wealth is stored up in housing, and down the line you're going to have generation. The sort of so the generation with all the wealth is the generation that owns the property. And okay, yes, it does get passed down through families, but what about those who don't have parents who own their own homes? My worry is that the wealth gap in this country is just going to get wider and wider and wider between the haves and the have-nots. So it boils back, how is this affordable and council housing going to be funded? It probably will have to be funded by building open market homes, but those open market homes need to be homes that local people need and can afford, not the sort of millionaires' houses that I see sometimes coming up, because that doesn't really help anybody apart from a tiny minority.
Okay, thank you, Loic. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're going through quite a period of change, as they changed both within local government, but also within planning. And there's, the NPPF changes obviously landed at the end of last year to sort of set the parameters of how plans are going to come forward. So plans both in the present system, but also in the new system as well. So, but there's lots of other bits of things that are going to flow on from this as well. And I think, as Michael said, the infrastructure bill. Infrastructure and planning bill, which sounds like it's going to land this week, is going to have a lot. He's going to have a lot of things which in there, which are going to start to lay out a blueprint, if you like, of how it's going to go forward. There'll be lots of things in that which will take quite a while to come through over time as well. But at least I think there'll be a bit of clarity there. But I hope today has been a useful exercise in just being able to get an update on those changes, and also kind of to see some of the land that's coming, some of the work that's coming forward as well. I just want to say a couple of big thank yous. I want to say a big thank you to actually my colleagues and PAS who have been working in the background to try and to make this thing run smoothly. So thank you very much. A thank you to the panel for giving your time and sort of and being the funnel for the questions that were coming in, and also kind of speaking with your candor as well, kind of on how this is kind of impacting both as you see it in the wider, but also kind of within your own authorities, and also to the LGA as well, because the panel have all come from the LGA political groups as well. So I really do appreciate that. But finally, just to say a big thank you to everybody who's contributed all the questions. They've been really good. We are actually going to keep Slido open for at least another day. So if anyone's got any really burning questions they want to put in, feel free to kind of post them up, and we will say we are going to look at them all and try and look at some frequently asked questions in relating to this and the subsequent sessions. Well, we're in the middle of them actually, sessions that we're doing with officers as well. This has been recorded and the presentation will be shared along with the recording. So everybody who's booked onto the course will get access to it, and then we will put it up onto the PAS website, and then we will also advertise it when it hits the website through the PAS bulletin. So if anyone isn't signed up to receive the PAS bulletin, go to you can find the Planning Advisory Service website pages as part of the local government site. And if anyone needs to get in touch, drop us a line at paz@local.gov.uk. But on that, I'm going to say thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you all again soon.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
Thank you too.
And Paz.